Some say that loneliness is a sound, a high, thin whistling of wind through the cracks of a heavy timber door, but for Gideon Thorne, loneliness was simply the geography of his existence. He was a man carved from the granite of the mountain ranges that bordered the territory, a towering figure of broad shoulders and grim silence who owned more land than God had seemingly intended for one man to keep. The townsfolk of Silver Hollow whispered that his heart had frozen over years ago, calcified by a tragedy no one dared speak of aloud, leaving behind only a ruthlessly efficient rancher who valued cattle over company and silence over song. It was the winter of 1885, a season so bitter that the frost seemed to possess a malice of its own, biting through wool and leather with invisible, icy teeth. The town of Silver Hollow was buried under 3 feet of snow, the boardwalks creaking under the weight of the drifts, and the air smelled perpetually of wood smoke and freezing iron. On this particular Tuesday, the social fabric of the town was pulled tight with anticipation because Gideon Thorne had ridden down from the high ridge. He did not come for conversation. He did not come to court the widows who lined the promenade in their velvet bonnets, their cheeks pinched pink by the cold and their eyes hungry for his fortune. He came because the heel of his left boot had torn loose during a struggle with a spooked stallion, and the snow was seeping into his sock, a wet, numbing reminder of his own mortality. He walked down the center of the street, his spurs chiming a low, threatening rhythm, ignoring the fluttering eyelashes of Mrs. Higgins and the overt waves of the mayor's daughter. They saw a king in a buffalo coat, he saw only obstacles between him and the repair of his gear. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against his lungs with every breath, crystallizing in his dark beard. He was a man who communicated through action, and right now, his only objective was to fix the breach in his armor. The torn boot was not just an annoyance. In this weather, wet feet meant frostbite, and frostbite meant weakness. Gideon Thorne did not tolerate weakness, least of all in himself. He paused before the weathered sign of the local mercantile and cobbler shop, his shadow stretching long and dark across the snow, a predator pausing before entering a den. The widows watched him, whispering behind gloved hands, speculating on his savage nature, unaware that the only thing on his mind was the stinging sensation of ice against his heel and the need for a craftsman who wouldn't waste his time with idle chatter. The interior of the mercantile was dim, smelling of oiled leather, dried tobacco, and the stale dust of a business that was slowly dying. Behind the counter stood Silas Vane, a man whose greed was written in the sweaty sheen of his forehead and the nervous wringing of his hands. But Gideon did not look at Vane. His eyes, accustomed to scanning horizons for lost calves or approaching storms, swept the room and landed in the far corner, near the drafty back entrance. There, seated on a low stool amidst a pile of discarded harnesses and scraps, was a woman who seemed to be trying very hard to disappear. She was Mai, a 25-year-old Chinese woman whose presence in Silver Hollow was a subject of scorn for the ignorant and indifference for the cruel. She wore a high-necked prairie dress of beige cotton, a fabric far too thin for the season, patched neatly at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, sensible bun, though a few strands of ink-black hair had escaped to frame a face that possessed a quiet, porcelain dignity. She was small, appearing almost fragile against the backdrop of rough-hewn beams and iron tools, but her hands were moving with a fluid, rhythmic grace as she polished a bridle. She kept her head down, her posture submissive, a survival mechanism honed over years of being treated as invisible labor. Vane, seeing the imposing figure of Gideon Thorne fill the doorway, immediately puffed up his chest, his voice taking on an oily, obsequious tone. He rushed forward, nearly tripping over a sack of grain, eager to please the wealthiest man in the territory. He began to babble about shipments and special orders, his voice high and grating in the quiet shop. Gideon ignored him, pulling the heavy, snow-crusted glove from his hand and pointing to his boot. The leather was flapped open at the sole, a jagged tear that exposed the layers beneath. He didn't speak, he simply presented the problem. Vane looked at the boot, then at his own soft, incompetent hands. He stammered, making excuses about the town cobbler being drunk or dead or away, claiming the repair would take a week, maybe 2, as he lacked the proper heavy-duty awl. Gideon's eyes narrowed, the temperature in the room seeming to drop to match the blizzard outside. He did not have a week. He did not have 2 days. He had a ranch to run and cattle to save. It was then that a soft, melodic clatter broke the tension. Mai had set down the bridle and picked up a heavy, curved needle from her workbench. She did not look up, but her voice, barely a whisper, cut through Vane's bluster like a razor through silk. "I can fix it," she said, her accent slight but her tone certain. "If the leather is dry, I can fix it now." Vane turned on her with a sneer, ready to reprimand her for speaking out of turn, for daring to address a man of Thorn's stature. He opened his mouth to order her back to the scullery, to tell her she was merely a shop girl, good for scrubbing floors and nothing more. But Gideon raised a hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that silenced the shopkeeper instantly. The rancher walked past the counter, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, until he stood towering over Mai. Up close, he could smell the faint scent of soap and sage that clung to her, a clean, earthy smell that contrasted with the musty shop. He looked down at her hands. They were red from the cold, the knuckles slightly swollen, but the fingers were long and dexterous. She did not flinch away from his looming presence, though she kept her eyes lowered, fixing her gaze on the hem of her beige dress. "Show me," Gideon rumbled, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in the small space. He sat on a crate nearby, extending his leg. Mai moved with a quiet efficiency that mesmerized him. She did not tremble. She reached out, her small hand brushing against his calf to steady the boot, and for a fleeting second, Gideon felt a jolt of electricity arc through him, a sensation of contact he hadn't experienced in a decade. She inspected the tear with the eye of a master surgeon. She reached for her tools, not the rusty, dull instruments Vane kept for show, but a small, personalized kit she kept rolled in a scrap of velvet. She took an awl, a spool of waxed black thread, and a curved needle. She began to work, and the silence that settled over the room was heavy and profound. Vane watched from the counter, stewing in jealousy, while Gideon watched Mai. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips pressed together as she forced the needle through the thick, tough leather of his boot. She was not just sewing, she was engineering a solution. She used a double stitch, locking the thread in place with a complexity he recognized from saddle making. It was competent work. It was beautiful work. It was the work of someone who took pride in mending what was broken, regardless of whether the world acknowledged her value. The minutes stretched out, marked only by the soft snick-snick of the needle and the howling of the wind against the window panes. Mai worked with a speed that belied the difficulty of the task. The leather of Gideon's boots was bullhide, tough as iron, yet she maneuvered the needle with a strength that seemed impossible for her slender frame. Gideon found himself studying her features, the sweep of her lashes, the determined set of her jaw. He realized, with a start, that she was beautiful. Not in the painted, desperate way of the town widows who sought his fortune, but in a quiet, enduring way, like a wildflower blooming in a rock crevice. She was ignoring him, focused entirely on the task, and that fascinated him more than any flotation ever could. When she tied off the final knot, she bit the thread with her teeth, a small, feral gesture that made her seem suddenly very human, and smoothed the wax over the seam with her thumb. She sat back, wiping her hands on her apron, and finally looked up. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "It will hold, sir," she said softly. "The snow will not get in." Gideon flexed his foot. The repair was seamless, tighter and stronger than the original stitching. He stood up, testing his weight. It was perfect. He looked at Vane, who was now smiling ingratiatingly, ready to collect the payment for work he hadn't done. Gideon reached into his coat and withdrew a gold eagle, a coin worth more than the entire inventory of the shop. Vane's eyes bulged. He reached out his greedy hand, his fingers twitching. "Excellent, excellent," Vane stuttered. "I trained her myself, you know." Good help is so hard to. Gideon did not hand the coin to Vane. Instead, he turned his back on the shopkeeper entirely. He stepped closer to Mai, who shrank back slightly, unsure of his intent. Gideon took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers, and pressed the gold coin into her palm. Her skin was rough, chapped from cold and labor, and the contact made his chest ache with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "This is yours," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "For the work." The atmosphere in the shop shifted from tension to absolute shock. Vane sputtered, his face turning a mottled red. "Sir! She is my servant." Her earnings belong to the house. You cannot simply. Gideon turned his head slowly, fixing Vane with a look of such concentrated menace that the shopkeeper choked on his own words. I pay the craftsman, Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of an approaching avalanche. Not the parasite. He looked back at Mai, who was staring at the gold coin in her hand as if it were a burning coal. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Outside the window, the faces of the town's elite women were pressed against the glass, their expressions scandalized. They had watched the beast of Black Ridge ignore them only to pay a fortune to the shy, invisible girl in the beige dress. Gideon saw their judgment, and he saw the fear in Mai's eyes, fear of what Vane would do to her once Gideon left, fear of the retribution for accepting such a gift. He realized then that he could not leave her here. The thought was irrational, impulsive, and entirely against his nature, but it struck him with the force of a revelation. She had fixed his boot, she had mended his armor. In this harsh, unforgiving world, competence was the only currency that mattered, and she was rich in it. He looked at the thin fabric of her dress, the lack of a fire in her corner of the shop, the cruelty etched into Vane's face. "Do you have belongings?" Gideon asked her. Mai blinked, confused. "So. Belongings," he repeated, his tone practical, as if discussing livestock. "A coat. Tools. A bag." Mai nodded slowly, terrified hope beginning to dawn in her expression. "I have. A small trunk." In the back. Gideon nodded once. "Get it." He turned to Vane, who was now trembling. "She is leaving. If you try to stop her, I will buy this building and burn it to the ground for the sport of it." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Vane shrank behind the counter. Gideon did not wait for an answer. He waited for Mai. He stood guard like a sentinel of old, a stone wall between her and the world that had used her, until she emerged moments later with a battered carpet bag and a threadbare shawl. They exited the shop into the teeth of the gale. The wind hit them with physical force, screaming down the street, whipping the snow into blinding vortices. The town widows and curious onlookers gasped as they saw Gideon Thorne, the unapproachable Titan, emerge with the Chinese seamstress at his side. He did not look at them. He marched toward his sleigh, a heavy, iron-reinforced cutter hitched to two massive black draft horses that stomped and snorted in the cold. Mai struggled against the wind, her thin shoes slipping on the ice, her shawl useless against the biting freeze. Without breaking stride, Gideon unbuttoned his massive buffalo hide coat. He stopped, turned to her, and in a movement that was shockingly tender for a man of his size, he wrapped the coat around her. It swallowed her small frame, the heavy fur smelling of pine and tobacco, instantly cutting off the biting wind. He lifted her, literally lifted her off the ground as if she weighed no more than a sparrow, and placed her onto the seat of the sleigh, tucking the heavy wool blankets around her until only her eyes were visible. He climbed in beside her, his presence a massive, radiating source of heat. He took the reins, his bare hands impervious to the cold, and snapped the leather. The horses lunged forward, and the sleigh tore away from the town, leaving the gaping socialites and the sputtering Vane behind in a cloud of powder. The journey to the ranch was a battle against the elements. The world was a white void, the trail visible only to Gideon's experienced eye. Mai sat frozen in a mix of terror and awe, buried in the scent of him, feeling the warmth of his thigh pressed against hers through the layers of blankets. He drove with a stoic intensity, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. When they finally crested the ridge and the ranch house came into view, a sprawling fortress of timber and stone, glowing with the golden light of lanterns, Mai felt tears prick her eyes. It was not just a house, it was a sanctuary. Gideon pulled the horses to a halt in the sheltered courtyard. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy oak door shut against the storm. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. The interior was vast, filled with the crackle of a massive stone hearth that dominated the room. He set her down near the fire. "Warm yourself," he commanded, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier edge. He moved to stoke the fire, adding logs until the flames roared. For the first time in her life, Mai stood in a room where the cold could not reach her, watched over by a man who looked at her not with disdain, but with a quiet, brooding respect. The days that followed the blizzard were a time of quiet transformation, a slow and steady thawing that had little to do with the temperature outside and everything to do with the atmosphere inside the fortress of Gideon Thorne's ranch. For the first 2 days, Mai moved through the house like a ghost, terrified that the heavy fall of a boot meant she was to be cast back out into the snow, or worse, returned to the shopkeeper vein. But the violence never came. Gideon was a man of routines as rigid as iron rails, rising before the sun to tend to his livestock and returning only when the sky was the color of a bruised plum. During his absence, Mai began to wage a war of her own, a war against the neglect that had allowed the great house to succumb to dust and disorder. The kitchen, once a chaotic landscape of unwashed skillets and scattered feed bags, became her domain. She found joy in the scrubbing of pine floors, the rhythmic sweeping of the hearth, and the polishing of the silver that had been tarnished black by years of disuse. It was not servitude, it was an act of claiming space, of weaving herself into the fabric of the home. On the third evening, Gideon returned to a house that smelled not of stale grease and cold ash, but of rosemary, roasting venison, and lemon oil. He stopped in the threshold of the kitchen, stomping the snow from his boots, and stared. The table was set. A fire roared with a precise, cheerful intensity. Mai stood by the stove, her hands folded nervously in her apron, watching him with wide, dark eyes. She had used the leftover heavy wool from his coat repair to patch the drafty curtains, and the room held its heat for the first time in memory. Gideon said nothing initially, his gaze sweeping over the order she had coaxed from the chaos. He walked to the table and sat, the heavy oak chair creaking under his weight. He took a bite of the stew she had prepared, a rich, savory broth that tasted of patience and skill. He looked up at her, and the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to soften, if only by a fraction. "You work too hard," he rumbled, though his tone lacked any bite. "I brought you here to be safe, not to be a maid." Mai took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling but clear. "A house must breathe, sir." "I am only helping it breathe." Gideon chewed slowly, watching her. "Sit," he commanded gently, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "You will not stand while I eat. In this house, we break bread together." The deepenings of winter brought with them a deepening of the strange, silent bond between the rancher and the sempstress. The outside world was a white hell of drifting snow and howling gales, but inside, the ranch became a cocoon of warmth and unspoken intimacy. Gideon began to find reasons to linger indoors during the midday hours, inventing tasks that required him to be near the fire, and near her. He watched her constantly, not with the predatory gaze of the men in town, but with a fascination that bordered on reverence. He watched her hands, those capable, scarred hands that could mend the thickest leather or stir a delicate sauce with equal grace. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters like a desperate spirit, Gideon approached her where she sat mending one of his work shirts by the light of an oil lamp. He held a package wrapped in brown paper, which he placed awkwardly on her lap. Mai looked up, startled. She unwrapped it to reveal yards of heavy, crimson velvet and a bolt of fine white silk, fabric so luxurious they seemed alien in the rugged surroundings. "For you," Gideon said, his voice gruff to hide his vulnerability. "The beige. It does not suit you. It is the color of dust." "You are not dust." Mai ran her fingers over the velvet, her eyes filling with tears. No one had ever given her something beautiful, she had only ever been expected to create beauty for others. "I cannot accept this," she whispered, looking up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It is too much." Gideon sank down onto one knee, a movement that brought him to her eye level, shattering the physical distance between them. He reached out, his large, rough hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray lock of black hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, scorching her skin with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "It is not enough," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur that vibrated in her chest. "You have mended my boots, my home, my life. This is merely cloth. You have given me peace, Mai. That is a debt I can never repay." For a moment, the air between them was thick with unsaid words, a magnetic pull that drew them closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, surrendering to the safety of his touch. However, the world of men is rarely content to leave peace undisturbed, and the isolation of the high ridge could not hide them forever. It was a week later when the barking of the ranch dogs shattered the morning calm. Gideon was in the barn, and Mai was in the kitchen kneading dough, her new crimson dress, which she had sewn with the fabric he gave her, swishing softly around her ankles. She heard the crunch of wagon wheels on the frozen snow and felt a cold pit of dread open in her stomach. She looked out the window to see a black carriage flanked by 3 men on horseback. Leading them was Vane, wrapped in a coat that looked too expensive for him, his face twisted in a mask of righteous indignation. Beside him rode the sheriff, a man known more for his laziness than his malice, but dangerous nonetheless. Mai froze, the flour dusting her hands like spectral snow. She knew why they were there. She was a woman without status, a foreigner in a land that viewed her as property, and Vane had come to reclaim his lost asset. The door to the ranch house burst open, not by Gideon, but by Vane, who strode in with the arrogance of a man who believes the law is on his side. "There she is!" Vane shrieked, pointing a gloved finger at Mai. "The thief! The runaway!" The sheriff stepped in behind him, looking uncomfortable. "Now, hold on, Vane," the sheriff muttered. "Let's do this proper." Mai backed against the stove, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting to the heavy iron skillet, calculating if she could defend herself. Vane sneered, stepping closer, his eyes raking over her fine red dress. "Look at her! Dressed like a harlot in stolen silks. I knew you seduced him, you witch. You'll work off the debt in the mines for this." He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers like claws. But before he could touch her, the room suddenly darkened. A shadow fell over the group, vast and terrifying. Gideon Thorne stood in the doorway, and he did not look like a man, he looked like a natural disaster given human form. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in one hand, but it was the look in his eyes, a cold, dead emptiness that promised absolute violence, that made the sheriff take 2 steps back. "Take your hand off her," Gideon said. The volume of his voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried the acoustic properties of a cracking glacier. Vane froze, his hand inches from Mai's sleeve. He turned slowly, trying to summon his bluster, but faltered under the weight of Gideon's stare. She is a thief, Mr. Thorne," Vane stammered, sweating despite the chill. "She stole from my shop. She broke her contract. The law says." Gideon walked into the room, the sound of his spurs ringing like funeral bells. He did not raise the rifle, he simply set it against the wall, a gesture that was somehow more threatening because it implied he didn't need a weapon to dismantle these men. He walked past Vane and stood directly in front of Mai, placing his body between her and the intruders. He turned to face them, crossing his arms over his chest. "What contract?" Gideon asked. "The one where you worked her for 7 years without pay? The one where you starved her?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "Now, Gideon, rights are rights. Mr. Vane here says she owes him for room and board." Gideon laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. It landed with a heavy slap. "I bought the building," Gideon said simply. Vane blinked. "What?" "Your shop," Gideon continued, his voice boring, as if reciting a grocery list. "I wired the bank in the city 3 days ago. I bought the mortgage. I own the walls, the roof, the inventory, and the debt. You are trespassing on my property, Vane. Not just here, but in town." The blood drained from Vane's face. You can't." "I can," Gideon said, stepping forward, forcing Vane to retreat. "And as the owner of the establishment, I have dissolved all prior contracts. Mai owes nothing. You, however, are currently trespassing on the private residence of the woman who owns the deed to the mercantiles." Gideon turned to Mai, his eyes softening. "I put it in your name this morning. It is your shop now." The silence in the room was absolute. Vane looked from Gideon to the terrified, hopeful face of Mai, realizing he had been outmaneuvered by a force of nature he couldn't comprehend. The sheriff, sensing the shift in power, tipped his hat to Gideon. "Well, that settles that, I reckon. Civil matter resolved." He turned to Vane. "Best get moving, Vane." Unless you want to explain to the new landlord why you're harassing her. Vane fled the house like a rat escaping a sinking ship, the door slamming behind him. When the sound of the wagon faded, the tension in the room snapped. Mai slumped against the counter, her knees giving way, but Gideon was there instantly, catching her in his arms. He held her tight, lifting her effortlessly, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "I told you," he murmured into her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "You are safe. No one touches you." Not ever again. Mai clung to him, sobbing, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being valued, of being loved. "Why?" she asked, pulling back to look at his rugged face. "Why do this for me?" Gideon looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a quiet, burning devotion. "Because you fixed my boots," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And because you fixed me." Months later, when the snow finally melted and the high ridge exploded in a riot of wildflowers, the town of Silver Hollow had a new legend to tell. They spoke of the wedding, a private affair held in the meadow behind the ranch, where the bride wore crimson silk and the groom, the formidable Gideon Thorne, looked at her as if she were the sun itself. The mercantile in town reopened, not as a dusty trap of greed, but as a place of fair trade and exquisite craftsmanship, run by a woman whose quiet dignity commanded more respect than Vane ever had. They say that on quiet nights, if you rode past the Thorne Ranch, you wouldn't hear the whistling of a lonely wind anymore. You would hear the sound of a violin, or laughter, or the simple, peaceful silence of two people who had found their home in each other. Gideon Thorne had ignored all the pretty widows, it was true. But in the end, he had chosen the only heart that was strong enough to mend his own, and in doing so, he had found a treasure far greater than all the land in the territory. The storm had passed, and the winter was over.